Can you hear me? Is the sound on now? You can hear me? Okay, well. Oh, okay. Sorry for the delay, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Newton Historical Society's first presentation of 2019. Tonight's program is New England Quilts and the Stories They Tell. Our presenter is Pamela Weeks. Pam Weeks is the Binney family curator of the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Mass., a great place to go visit. Author of the book Civil War Quilts and articles on quilt history, she lectures nationally on quilt making and quilt history. Pam uses quilts to tell stories of the Civil War, women's history, and industrial history. We want to thank the New Hampshire Humanities Council for helping us to sponsor this program tonight. Before I turn over the microphone to Pam, I have a couple of housekeeping things. There are two exits from this room. Behind you are the double doors, and over to your right, that door. The restrooms are behind you through the double doors. Over on the wall to your right is a table where we have books for the Newton 250th anniversary. There are plenty of books there. They're free. If you want one, please take one. We also have a donation box there. When we have programs that are co-sponsored by New Hampshire Humanities Council, we ask for your donation, and then the Historical Society will match the proceeds, and we donate it all to the Newton Food Pantry. We would ask if you would silence your cell phones unless you're a first responder. And tonight we're being broadcast live on local channel 20. Without further ado, Pam Weeks.
Thank you. So if we're being broadcast tonight, that means we have to behave ourselves a little, doesn't it? I thank you for inviting me tonight. And I'd love to start out my lectures with a question for you, and it's always answered differently for a historical association. How many of you, like me, did not enjoy history in school? See, very few people will admit it for a historical society. Why didn't we like history? Why was it dry? Facts and dates, and who were the facts and dates about? Men. And what do men do more than anybody else? They have wars. So for me in school, history was about men, dates, and wars, because I will admit it, I'm 67, and when I was in school, history was taught using the written word. We learned what happened in the past from what was written. The majority of what we studied at the time was written by, now, sir, don't take offense from this. The stories are not about women, but there are other ways to learn about history. Does anybody know what it's called when you fall in love with history because you love a thing or stuff? Anybody know what it's called? Obsession. Obsession works. Obsession works. Yep, I'm a little obsessed. It's called material culture studies. Material culture studies is a formal name for falling in love with history because you love stuff. Now with me, it's obviously quilts. I've been a quilter all my life. I never liked history in school, but I had a grandfather who was the family genealogist and an expert on our family history. I'm the 10th generation in my father's family to live in New Hampshire, and the 12th generation in my mother's family, although her family came to Amesbury and Newburyport and then came to New Hampshire, so it's kind of a cheat. With me, it's quilts. My brother is an automotive engineer, and he loves car design. He fell in love with a 1959 Chevy El Camino that has the cat's eyes, what's the word I want? Not the fins, big fins. And before he knew it, he was researching who the designers were from the 1940s and 50s in cars. So it could be whatever you love, and if you love it enough, then you'll want to know more about it. And if you're not careful, you'll be down a rabbit hole, which is what we call deep research about something. Right now, my deep research is about a quilt made in Manchester, New Hampshire. And I'm finding myself rereading about the mill girls that came to Manchester and on and on. But there are lots of different things that we can learn from quilts. And we're going to talk about some of them tonight. So how many quilters are in the room? You may not answer the following question. What's a quilt? And if you're married to a quilter, you can't answer it either. Give me a definition of what you're holding. Were you ladies quilters? What's a quilt? What are you seeing in front of you? All right, easiest way to answer it. What's the difference between a quilt and a blanket? Pieces decorate the top. A little bit of applique in this one.
I would say it was something that was useful that was made out of something that had no use.
Sometimes. We're going to talk about that. Material that's used, it can be one of 4 natural fibers back in the 19th, 17th, 18th centuries. But again, what is a blanket? It's woven. How many layers does a blanket have? How many layers does a quilt have? Thank you, that's the answer that we're after. You'll see a top that can be decorated in some way. You'll see a backing that sometimes is decorated, sometimes is just fabric. And what's holding those 3 layers together? Stitching. It can be by hand, and I think I think this one's machine quilted, and I think these 2 are hand quilted. Can you tell with that one? Machine quilted? Yeah, I'm pretty lazy. I quilt by machine whenever I can. But it's not cheating, and we'll talk about, remind me if I don't talk to you about the history of the sewing machine. Sometimes I skip it. So that's a quilt. And why do we care? Well, I'll answer it for you. It's because it's made of fabric, and what are we all wearing tonight? Fabric. So what quilting did to me is it really turned me into a textile historian. Quilting is just part of it. And it's the history of textiles that we're going to talk about today, and the good things that they've done for us and the bad things that bits of that history have happened. So we're going to go and do a little bit of Fiber 101. Who can tell me what the 4 natural fibers are? Cotton, linen, silk, and wool. I heard all of them. There's actually another one very frequently used now, or more in use, which is bamboo. But we're going to talk about the 19th century, and nobody was doing bamboo fiber back in the 19th century. But be careful what you say, because, no, I can't think of an example. China, what I'm thinking of actually is Hawaii and some of the islands that used bark, and they didn't really process it as fiber, but they smashed it thin and they decorated it for use for clothing and stuff. But we'll not go there. We'll stick with those 4. So if you have a natural fiber in front of you, the first thing you have to do is harvest it. And after you harvest it, what's the next step? Anybody know? You have to clean it, wash it, or card it. Generally wash it. Washing is followed by carding. And what does carding do? It stretches the fiber, but more than stretching it, it gets them going in the same direction. Exactly. It gets those fibers all going in the same direction. And I go like this because you've probably all seen wool being carded. And if you haven't been to New Hampshire Wool Weekend, it happens on Mother's Day weekend at the Deerfield Fairgrounds. It's really an interesting weekend to show up. They do a sheep to shawl competition where they actually shear a sheep in the morning and they have a finished product by the afternoon. But I digress. So carding, then we do what? We spin, and spinning keeps those fibers going in the same direction, and it gives us, whether it's a tiny little thread or a big fat piece of roving, we call it yarn. And the yarn can then be dyed before weaving, or woven and then treated for color or for different finishes after it's woven. So what I'm building up to is my next question, because somebody needs to tell me what was the Industrial Revolution. I'll take those quilts if you want me to. Who can tell me what the Industrial Revolution was? They took a lot of the manual stuff and they automated it. And what did they want to make first? They wanted to make fabric. They wanted to make fiber first. Can you tell me where it happened? England. We've got some ringers in this crowd. And when? 1700s, the late 1700s. I just reviewed my background information on that, and they were spinning first The difference between, all right, so it was all being done by hand, and they used what kind of power? And then after that, they used water power. They harnessed the water power to run the machines. They were spinning as early as the 1780s in England. And in this country, the spinning was the easiest to do. It was getting the yarn strong enough to weave it by machine afterwards that took another 15 to 20 years. In this country, the earliest was 1793 in Rhode Island, followed fast on by a mill in the western part of New Hampshire, which I was just reading about the other day. So they were producing textiles by machine, weaving in England 1790s, and weaving in this country 1790 to 1801, something like that. The Blackstone River, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, Samuel Slater was the earliest one. What had to happen? Tell me about the water source. What did the water have to do? Moving fast or dropping in elevation? And if it wasn't moving fast or dropping, what did they do? They built a dam. Where are your early, now there were mills before textile mills all over New England. And often a village was organized around the water source for the mills. Do you guys know where your early mill sites were for Newton? So summarize that for the folks at home. It was where?
If you go down the Peanut Trail,
The Peanut Trail.
which is an old railroad bed,
Oh, I just read about the peanut train in the history. Yep.
and off, if you were headed from here over to the junction, if you go off to the left on one of those trails, it takes you up to the foundations on an old building, and there's a water source in there, and I saw a map today that actually called that a mill pond.
And guess why they called it the mill pond? Exactly. There was a mill there. Thank you. One of the things I've given this talk a lot around New Hampshire, and what I love is people that know their local history and know where those early mill sites. Now, was the village sort of organized around that early site, or was it not so much? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The village also might be organized where the trails were or where the transportation routes were, and it moved depending on where the railroad went through, or they moved the railroad closer. Anyway, digressing again. So we have mills, we have them cooking along in New England, and the things that astonish me, I know that they were spinning cotton as early as 1801, 1811, in that time period, and the industry got going so quickly and spread so fast, so big, that by 1835, the New England mills were producing and printing more than 65 million yards of cotton per year. Think about that. In a period of 25 years, the sizes of the mills got so big, so many people moved to the mill towns from the small New Hampshire towns. Eventually, immigrants came, but that's how quickly it grew. So if the fabric that you wanted to use for your dresses or for your quilts or for your bed coverings, some was produced at home. You would harvest, clean, spin, and weave your fiber, but a lot was imported, and it cost dollars or pounds per yard. What would happen to that value when all of a sudden you have millions of yards? It dropped precipitously. So a lot of people think of quilts as items of necessity that are made from leftover clothing. In reality, the first quilts that came to the colonies came as luxury items. They were whole cloth quilts. They were made of cotton, of silk, or wool first. We know that quilts were made of leftover clothing, but they were used up and not saved. So what survives from the 1600s, the first mention of a quilt is in an estate inventory in the 1690s. People were much more likely to use blankets, bed rugs, or coverlets, the woven of usually 2 or 3 colors. Quilts came later. So by 1825, 1830, young women who wanted to make quilts could easily afford to go out and buy the fabric that they wanted. And we have a huge explosion in the making of quilts. Think about fashion at the time. There was another explosion. Who loves Jane Austen as much as I do? And you've watched her movies on TV, the movies of her books, and what kind of dresses do the girls wear? They're kind of tight in the bust, and they drop straight to the ground, and there's maybe Empire, exactly. What happened by 1830? What did those skirts do? Because the value of the price of cotton went so low that they went from a little tiny dress to a dress with as many as 26 yards of fabric in some of the skirts. But think of it, the majority of cotton produced at that time was only 25 inches wide. So we're used to, us quilters are used to 44 inches wide at least. But that's how big some of the skirts were. All right. We're going to talk about wool first. How many of you have been to one of Steve Taylor's talks on the only, or how many can tell me, the only time that New Hampshire agriculture was successful? Anybody know what it was? I'm holding in front of you a clue. This quilt, I meant to mention, the quilts in front of you, if you didn't bring them in, belong to me. They do not belong to the museum. And I have collected them to be examples for the different talks that I give. Now, I've already taught you that a quilt has 3 layers, and you can see that this one only has 1. But when I can find a top that gives an example of what I want, then I will bring a top because it weighs 1/4 as much as a full quilt. And I like my whole talk to fit into one tub. This is a wool quilt. The one time that New Hampshire agriculture was really successful was in the 1820s to the 1840s, and we were raising sheep. And the sheep produced 2 things, meat and fiber. And the New Hampshire wool mills, especially Manchester, the Amoskeag mills were known worldwide for the high quality of their dress goods. This is wool. Almost every piece in here. This is an interesting top because it has pieces from the 1860s, the 1840s, and this I still think is a blend. So somebody had a good scrap bag and she put it together. But when we can no longer get dress weight wool like this, it is really comfortable. I used to do Civil War reenactment, and I did a dress in a dress weight wool that I went to New York City for and paid a big price for the dress weight wool. So how would that agricultural success have changed New Hampshire's landscape?
No more trees. I remember hearing about how we used to be completely deforested.
We were. My grandfather used to say that in 1880, left over from the sheep farming, New Hampshire was 80% cleared south of the White Mountains. 80% cleared. That's why you can walk through the woods and see stone walls. By 1980, Grandpa died in 1995. By 1980, it was reversed. The 100 years had completely reversed it, and only 20% of New Hampshire south of the White Mountains was cleared. Fun little factoids. I am such a geek. Everybody see the purple in this? Yeah. Who watched Victoria on PBS? Did you catch her purple dress? Do you know the history behind that purple? So if you watched Victoria on PBS, you probably saw the segment where Prince Albert was supporting the scientists that were doing different things. So the British government supported science because they understood how important scientific discoveries could be for business. And they were particularly interested in the making of quinine. Why would the British government be interested in quinine? What does quinine cure? Malaria. Say it again? Leg cramp. Does it?
Yes, it does.
Really?
It's bad for your heart, but it takes care of your leg cramp.
All right, I'm having a gin and tonic every night. Thank you, good idea. What's your favorite gin? Bombay Sapphire for me. So anyway, so the British government was supporting scientists, and they were looking to synthesize quinine, and a Dr. Perkin was playing around with coal tar and made a mistake and splashed his latest concoction onto his shirt, and it turned him purple. So he had synthesized alizarin, purple. Alizarin can be purple to reds, and it was a huge, huge, wonderful thing because now they had a fast dye for dyeing their dresses purple, and Victoria got the first purple silk dress. See, you didn't know what you were going to learn tonight, did you? That Pam likes Bombay Sapphire. All right, lots of fads in quilt making, and a lot of the fads introduced us to the different kind of history. So what I'm holding up in front of you is an example of what I call a signature quilt or an album quilt or an inscribed quilt. Anybody heard of these puppies before? What were they made for? Practice. Good idea with the for different techniques. That's more like a sampler quilt though. A signature quilt was probably made for many different reasons. Somebody gave friendship, so a gift, exactly. Presentation. This one was made for somebody, I don't know quite who, but a lot of her family members signed it. Can you tell me what Uncle Charlie did?
See, blacksmith?
Uncle Charlie was a blacksmith. Those are horseshoe nails and horseshoes. I know you did because I flashed it at you too quickly. And how about Uncle Jack? Uncle Jack was a carpenter. Pa signed this one, just Pa. So signature quilts were a huge fad that started in the late 1830s and go to now. Have you participated in making a signature quilt for somebody? Make a block and sign it and turn the block in and... Oh, I made you give them to me, didn't I? You were in the potholder blocks. You were in my Civil War quilts class. That quilt is almost finished. I'll finish it someday. And they are sometimes the only quilts you can research because of the names on them. I told you that I'm the 10th generation in my family to live in New Hampshire, and when I fell in love with signature quilts, I figured this is going to be easy. At one point, I memorized all of my great-great and my great-grandmother's names so that when I was out antiquing, I could look for signature quilts. And one day, one came to auction. And I couldn't be there, so I sent my auntie to that auction, and she picked it up. And indeed, it had a signature on it for Sarah A. Levitt, who was my father's grandmother. Turns out in my research that my Sarah was Sarah L. Levitt, but it's a pretty cool quilt anyway, and that's really the time that I started to get really serious about the quilt history. So they're the same thing. How many of you had autograph books in school, or somebody signed your high school yearbook? Same thing, only on a quilt. It made the community real. It was your family, it was your neighborhood. They were also made and given to esteemed members of the community, like a minister who had served and was leaving. Later in the century, they were made in the thousands as fundraisers. You will see a signature quilt that might have 300 or 400 signatures on it. You can bet everybody paid a dime or a quarter to have their name on that, and they raised enough money to build an addition for the church or to do some sort of good for the community. So that was a big fad. Different fads include, now this is a fad, this is a very simple quilt, a simple for the style. There was a huge fad for red and green quilts. Can I ask you to help me for a minute? It's much more fun when we hold the whole thing up. You take that end. And this I collected in New Hampshire. It's dated 1860. We're going to go this way. So I think the red and green fad had partly to do with the money thing. They could afford to go out and buy all the muslin they needed for the background. Turkey red was often used in the red fabrics, and it was a very stable red dye. And the green could be a little less stable because they hadn't sorted out the green dyes yet. You can see how this is kind of an olive color, or so the green was a 2-color process. They would start with either blue and overdye with yellow, or yellow and overdye with blue. Just a huge, huge fad, and just about everybody wanted to make them. And we're going to turn it inside. And when you're ready, throw your other arm down here and we'll do it in quarters. Thank you. And I'll take it from there. Now, I started to tell you about that quilt that I collected at auction, and it's what turned me into a real historian. But because it was made in a very strange manner, it was made block by block. That red and green quilt, all the blocks were made, they were sewn together, layered with the batting and the backing, and then quilted. The quilt that I bought at auction with my almost great-great-grandmother's name was made block by block. Every block was individually finished. Can you see that with this construction? We call them potholder quilts. Anybody not know what a potholder is? That's why we stick with potholder quilts, even though it's probably incorrect historically. They would have been called kettle holders or pot handles or something like that. I got serious about wanting to know more about potholder quilts and started to collect them and to collect information on them. And I was asking friends for help, and I was keeping my information in a notebook, having a great deal of fun traveling around and finding these crazy potholder quilts. And one day my mentor in my research said, Pam, I know you're having fun, but it's time to get serious. We at least just sit down for 10 minutes and put that notebook in chronological order. And we were at a seminar together on quilt history, and I went dead quiet. And Lori looked at me and said, what's wrong? You're quiet. I'm not usually quiet. And I said, Lori, I've put the potholder quilt information in chronological order, and 6 of them were made for Civil War soldiers. And she went quiet because we both knew that quilts surviving made for Civil War soldiers are very, very rare. So I started digging in, and the joke on me is that my degree is in recreation resource management. I'm not a historian. I wasn't. My first job out of school was at Gunstock. I was Gunstock's first Nordic director at the mountain up there in Guilford. But I had always been quilting, and I always loved my family history. So I knew I was onto something, and how much fun it has been to keep going with the Civil War history. And if you had told me when I was 26 years old working at Gunstock that my first book was going to be on Civil War quilts, I would have told you you were nuts. But that's what happened. Because I took a deep dive, you have to read, when you want to learn about something, you have to read deep, which means read everything you can find on Civil War quilts, and there wasn't a lot at the time. And read wide, which means that you can read anything you can find about Civil War, women, quilt making, soldiers, battles, what was going on, to explain the background of the Civil War quilting. So in a nutshell, here's what I learned. At the beginning of the Civil War, neither the North or the South was prepared for the almost immediate muster of hundreds of thousands of men. Depending on what town you came from, you might go fully kitted out, or you might go just with the clothes on your back and expect to find what you need, uniform, bedding, clothing, food, at the recruitment centers. The boys would write home, Ma, I don't have enough bedding. Ma, I don't have enough clothes. Ma, I don't have enough food. And the people at home started sending stuff to the soldiers in kind of a willy-nilly way. A lot of this had been anticipated, and in New York City, before the war started, the war officially started in April of 1861. Well before that, in January and February, a group of women had been meeting in New York City and formed what became the Women's Central Committee. I've lost all the right acronym, but it was they knew that they needed to recruit and train nurses. They knew that they had to keep the conditions in the camps, in the hospitals, as clean as possible, because even though they didn't understand germ theory, they knew that a cleaner place had less disease. And the third reason they formed was to get stuff that was needed for the war effort where it was needed. So they tried to do that in an organized fashion. Within a couple of months of the start of the war, the United States government recognized the only official war organization, and it was called the United States Sanitary Commission. Anybody know what it morphed into after the war? The Red Cross, that's correct. One of the women who was one of those early organizers had worked with Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War, in which 12 men died of disease for every man who died of a wound on the battlefield. And they wanted to make that record better. They did, but still during the Civil War, 8 men died of disease for everyone who died on the battlefield. They got it better, but my interest in it was about the stuff. They were highly organized. The Sanitary Commission had offices in every state. In many states, there were many offices. If we were making quilts for the cause from Newton, our quilts and our stuff would probably have gone to Boston, where it would have been counted and acknowledged and recorded. So records from the Sanitary Commission are amazing. And in the 1980s, a quilt historian on whose shoulder I stand extrapolated the figures that she found and estimated that more than 250,000 quilts or comforters were made during the 4-year period of the Civil War. And if you follow her strict guidelines, which that they were long and narrow because the boys slept on cots, they were made of cheap materials because they knew they were going to be used up. And many of the ones that survive, even if they're as simple as the use of that red, white, and blue striped fabric, they have some kind of patriotic symbolism on them. Many of them have flags, they have eagles, they have shields. We only know where about 20 or 22 of the surviving quilts are. And what ties them to what we've already talked about is all of the quilts that survived are inscribed quilts. They have writing on them. And my theory about that is that, let's say you were coming home from your service in the Civil War, you've got on your ratty old uniform, you've got a ratty old quilt over your shoulder. If your wife lets you in the house before you strip down, she might or might not let you keep the quilt and the uniform. If they get cleaned up and put away, out of the trunk 3 generations later, somebody gets the uniform, but they don't get the quilt, what it was for, unless it has writing on it. And those quilts that survive either were donated to museums or they were passed down through families with other Civil War stuff. They wrote on it with pen and ink. So think of a dip pen in an inkwell and writing on fabric. There was a way to stretch the fabric taut, so it was had like a drum-like surface, and that's what the majority of them were written were. There were lots of instructions in the early homemaking books about how to prepare the fabric for writing, but generally it was done that simply. So we're going to stop on the Civil War and head after the Civil War. There were lots of other quilt fads, and one of them was for crazy quilts. Crazy quilts are called crazy quilts because they are crazy patchwork. Many of them are embroidered. They have flowers. They have different kinds of symbols on them. And they're made out of fancy fabrics like velvet and silk and satin. And if you have one in your family, the chances are pretty good that the fabrics did not come from your great-grandmother's silk dresses. Because unless she was very rich, she only had 1 or 2. One of the fun pieces of research about crazy quilts is that by 1880, they were such a huge fad, you could send 25 cents to Sears and Roebuck and in return get a 2-pound bag of scraps for your crazy quilts. This quilt is kind of interesting because they were such an industry. You could also order, this is a machine embroidered applique that you could purchase for sewing on your crazy quilt. So she did quite a bit of hand embroidery, but she also purchased several motifs. Crazy quilts will be filled with flowers. Anybody heard of the Victorian fad for the language of flowers? Flowers meant different things. You'll see a lot of different kinds of flowers on these. The other thing is they had something to do with the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, at which we saw Japanese craft for the first time. So many of the crazy quilts have fans, and they might have Kate Greenaway figures that are embroidered on them. There are many of them. This one has a moth. They will have, and there's actually another fan down here. They will have spider webs, which were considered good luck, and lots of different things. Now, kind of in reaction to that, after the crazy quilt, actually before we do that, the other fads at the end of the 19th century have to do with the amount of fabric that's available. This is called a hexagon quilt, and it is also called a charm quilt. Anybody know what a charm quilt is? Do you know what a charm quilt is? We have a ringer in the front row. Her answer is that a charm quilt has a different fabric in every piece. There's no fabric that's repeated here. And this is a kind of an interesting one because it has really, many of them were organized better than this one. This has no organization to it. And the other thing that's fun about this, and I'm not finding one right away, it has multiple prints with different colorways. The same print, but with different colorways. Did you find one? Yeah. Very similar. Also at this time, go ahead, show us.
Green and a brown.
Yeah, that's very similar. Very similar. And the fabrics are just wonderful. Yep, woven plaids. And actually this is a wool. That's another piece of dress wool. I can tell by the way they absorb color. Another fad at the time was for what are called competition quilts. And the newspapers, if you have, I have the Ancestry version that I can look at newspaper articles from forever. They were actually very nasty to the ladies who made quilts with 27,000 half-inch squares in them because they thought they were wasting their time. And there will be crazy articles about poor Mr. Smith down the road. His wife has just completed her quilt with 17,562 half-inch triangles, and he may get dinner yet. Okay, in reaction, there was a change in taste about 1900 for two-color quilts. You'll see them as early as the 1880s. This is an example that I can tell two stories with because it talks about the change in taste. And some quilt historians insist that tea quilts were for temperance. Quilts have been used for a very long time to address difficult social issues. The very earliest example dates to 1380. It is a set of quilted bed hangings that were part of an Italian estate, and they tell the story, and this is a very brief description of the story, of the good Italian Pope battling the bad French Pope. But if you were coming into this elegant bedroom, and in the time, and right up actually until our colonial period, if you were wealthy, you would often receive people in your bedroom. And the bedroom was often located on the first floor of the house. It had the most expensive furniture and bed hangings in it. And this set of wall hangings from that period would have hung on the bed, and you would have seen them as you come in the room, and recognized instantly that the French Pope had fleur-de-lis, and the Italian Pope had, I think, a different set of symbols on his shield, but it would have been easily recognized. And they were quilted. Think of using those quilting lines as pencil lines, as drawing lines. So in our history, the first quilt that's documented was made for an anti-slavery fair in 1837, and it was used for an auction or a raffle, and it raised money for the anti-slavery cause. There are quilts that are documented to be temperance quilts. They could be tea quilts, they could be drunkard path quilts. There's actually a pattern for a goblet that's supposed to be a temperance quilt, but I don't know why you would quilt a wine glass on your quilt if you weren't going to drink from it. But quilts, right up to today, there was a skip after the no quilts were made for women's suffrage. The girls were too busy out fighting for the vote. We only know of 2 possible ones. Then the next one, there was a big skip. The next ones that I know about are the 1970s. The Hudson River quilt is about environmental issues. There were peace quilts made in Boise, Idaho, exchanged with Moscow to protest nuclear armament. But lots of quilts have been made, and currently at the New England Quilt Museum, we have hanging an exhibit of art quilts organized by the Studio Art Quilt Associates. It's called Guns, Loaded Conversations. I'm very careful to say it's not an anti-gun exhibit, it's an anti-gun violence exhibit. And the quilts talk about different issues about the misuse of guns. From one, there's what's that horrible case where 2 6-year-olds were playing in their mother's bedroom and one accidentally shot the other, to some of the school shootings. And we were very careful to balance it with one of my docents is an NRA registered gun safety instructor. And she made sure that we balanced it with the positive side of gun ownership, especially for women. So, more fads. Early 1900s, I put that other quilt away. Same pattern, but look at the difference in color. The New England mills were beginning to die out in the 1930s and 40s, and I just read the date and I forget when the Amoskeag mills bit the dust. Darn it, anybody know? I'll have to review that information. Beautiful 1930s colors, and at this point the hexagons are called Grandmother's Flower Garden. A lot of people make the mistake of calling anything hexagon Grandmother's Flower Garden, but it's not called that until the 1930s. I'll dig out the other one, just a little bit difference in the sensibility of the colors. And hexagon quilts go back to they were very popular in the 1830s. Now, you brought us 2 quilts, so we get some sharing. What did you bring? Do you mind helping me again?
Is that feed sackcloth?
It is not feed sackcloth. So we can talk about feed sacks in just a minute. You've been busy. Oh. Do you mind standing up so the folks can hear you, or just turn around so they can hear you in the camera? So tell me what the pattern came from.
It's actually it's a pattern from Paula Barnes,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a sampler of all the different old blocks and stuff.
Your colors are gorgeous. It looks like an
Her
antique.
colors are gorgeous. She makes beautiful fabric,
Yes, she does.
and it has mitered corners.
So tell us again, the pattern is Paula.
It's a Paula Barnes sampler. It should be on
Let's
the.
hang it.
I hope I have a label on it.
Me too. I hope you do too.
Is it on the other side?
Must be. You must have it. Is it not that? Is it in a corner?
I don't have a label on it. Bad person.
Go ahead and spread it on the
I'm going
table.
to have to dig out and the pattern out and find out what the.
Because you brought us another one. Tell us about this one.
This is also another Paula Barnes, and it's called Harriet's Baskets.
Let's go
And did I label that one,
this
please?
way. We're holding it sideways so it won't touch the ground. Yep,
Yay!
Harriet's
I-
Baskets by
yeah.
Jane Hamill. And when did you make these, Jane?
The first one I made about 5 or 6 years ago, and that one about 4 years ago.
They're lovely.
No.
Jane did not quilt it, and this is not a disparaging remark. It's what we call quilting by check.
Yes, yes,
Jane paid a very good machine
yes.
quilter.
Diana Leslie from Pennsylvania. She did
She
some
did a
beautiful work. for
beautiful
me.
job on these. And quilting by check is not just our generation. There are records from the 19th century of people paying others to quilt their quilts.
I tried quilting by myself, but I quickly gave it up.
Thank you for sharing those. They're lovely. All right, we have 2 more quilts. What's happening now in the quilt world is that many people are making quilts for comfort for their beds, but many people are also making art quilts. And art quilts are made for the wall. They can be, you can make an art quilt out of a very traditional design with traditional fabrics. I like to say that I was an art quilt for about 15 minutes. I made this art quilt in the 1990s, and I took a class that I loved with Susan Carlson, who showed us how to take an 8x10 photograph and reduce it to almost paint by number, only it's quilt by number. And I call this Rising Daughter. That's me as a baby rising over the Belknap Mountains near Guilford. My father was the dreamer, and my mother was the foundation of the family. It contains raw edge applique, and as you can see, many photo transfers of different parts of my youth. So art quilts, the Studio Art Quilt Association Associates is a formal organization with more than 3,000 members around the world, but there are just hundreds of thousands of more people who are choosing fabric as their art medium. Now my last quilt, before I do my last quilt, I promised to talk to you about sewing machine history. Who knows when the sewing machine was invented? In common use, we'll make it easier. Middle 1800s. The sewing machine as we know it was actually used in the shoe industry. I've got to look that up again. I know for sewing, for home sewing, it was 1847. And it was invented by a man who lost his interest in his patent to Isaac Singer. There was a huge battle, a huge industrial rights battle, and it ended up with 3 different inventors sharing the profit. The first guy, so Singer, the guys, I hate my brain these days. Didn't have enough coffee. So inventor number 1 never made another sewing machine, but he got $5 for every sewing machine that Isaac Singer and the other partners sold. And by 1867, he was a multi-millionaire. Now, Mr. Singer is fun to talk about because so much of what he used in his marketing we're just used to today. Anybody in the room never had a car payment or a house payment? Guess who invented the time payment? Mr. Singer. Because if you were a woman of average means, the price of a sewing machine was the equivalent of 1 year husband's salary. So he decided that everybody should have a sewing machine and you could pay him so much per week until the sewing machine was paid off. How many have ever bought something because someone they admired or a star they thought was really cool was representing it? Guess who invented that? It's called influencer advertising. Mr. Singer. Who in 1850, 1860 would have been the most influential woman in your village? The preacher's wife. So he loaned a sewing machine to particular preachers' wives on the condition that she invite ladies into her parlor to see how easy it was to use the sewing machine. Anybody ever traded their car in for a new car? Mr. Singer invented the trade-in. You could trade in your white sewing machine for a Singer sewing machine. But what I hate is that he would take that white sewing machine out back and take a sledgehammer to it because he didn't want other brands competing with his. But he would give you the value of your white sewing machine toward your new Singer. And he had a partner who was actually the man behind the brilliance of all these marketing schemes. But this goes back to the 1850s, 1860s. And that's how quilting can teach us about the past and all the different things that I could talk to you for about 3 more hours. But our time is up. Does anybody have any questions? Oh, the last quilt. This is a quiz quilt. Who can tell me when Dacron polyester was invented?
Ask my husband, he's a chemist.
Give us the answer. You're about 10 years too late. My understanding is Dacron polyester was invented in the late 40s, early 50s. And if you're a quilt lecturer, you too can go on eBay and buy a polyester quilt top for $15 so that you can make the audience laugh for your last quilt. Have you ever seen anything uglier in your life?
All I can say is it's groovy.
It's groovy. It's groovy. It is. It's 50s and 60s from some of the pattern in it. And actually, polyester quilts are very collectible right now. Not ones like this, but the colors are so vibrant, and when they're well constructed and well designed, they're really spectacular. And I have a pretty good idea why some people don't finish them. Boing, 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 they stretch. So that's my talk, and I'm sticking to it. Any questions?
Quilt sack.
Oh, feed sacks. Right, so people ask about feed sack quilts all the time because that was a huge fad and another huge marketing ploy. The overriding term is textile bags. You could get salt, sugar, chicken feed, flour, anything in a textile sack. The earliest quilt that I own is probably 1850, and it has a little salt sack on the back. But what you're referring to are the printed ones. And they came with many prints, like the 1930s prints. And you can't ever say, a real quilt geek will say, you can't say it's really a textile sack quilt unless one of the pieces has the place where they pulled the string out of the top. And you can sometimes see that because those very smart producers of the textiles for those bags, and they did it. So let's say you go to the feed store and you buy a feed sack with this print in it because you want to make a dress. Well, the next 3 times you buy chicken feed, you're going to go to that company and buy that same kind of sack so that you have enough fabric, because I believe it was 44 by 60 inches are some of the larger textile bags, and that's not quite enough to make a dress out of. So it was another marketing plan, was to sell their product to you. But what they also did is they did the same print on bolt goods. So if you had the money to go to J.J. Newberry or whatever your dry goods store was, you could buy it off the bolt, or you got it for free when you bought your chicken feed. So unless you see the place where the strings were taken out of the bag, you can't definitively say that it's a feed sack quilt.
So it would be, but the fabric would be a cotton, correct?
Yes,
And when was that most popular?
1930s and 40s.
And is there any kind of catalog of those patterns?
There is. There is a very good book. I believe it's called Textile Bags, and you can go and get it on Amazon. And
But that is certainly, if you had a quilt and you found fabric that matched something, it would be a good indication that would be the vintage, right?
you can date a quilt or fabric by the style of the print. That's the easiest thing to do. It's very hard to date a quilt that doesn't have a print in it, because there were fads, and this is the fad from the 1930s and 40s, and this is the fad from the 1870s and 80s. And that's, you can tell by the colors and the style of the prints in which period.
Why is it you're saying that you don't think that is a feed sack?
I don't think it's a feed sack because these fabrics are many, many more of these fabrics were sold on the bolt.
But you're saying it would be the vintage?
It is the vintage.
Whether or not it actually came out of a feed sack, or whether or not it was that vintage?
Correct. It is the correct time period. The prints are correct, but the prints changed in feed sacks as well. They went into the 1950s and 60s.
Oh, really?
And the prints would change with the different fads for prints. But and you know what? The quilt police aren't going to come and get you if you say it's a feed sack quilt. Those of us who quilt a lot used to fear the quilt police, and now it's just, go away, leave me alone.
You can see the mistake if you're riding by
Yes.
on the
The-
going 30 miles an hour.
Exactly.
You need to rip it out, otherwise leave it alone.
Exactly. And for those of you who didn't hear that, there's a wonderful teacher named Eleanor Burns, and she encourages people to quilt. And your quilt, your rules. And if you have a mistake in your quilt, hold it. If it's your quilt and I'm holding it here, can you see the mistake? No, you don't have to rip it out. Or a horse, a galloping horse. If you can see the mistake from the back of a galloping horse, you should rip it out.
I thought I read once that quilts were used in the Underground Railroad as stories to sort of.
The question is about quilts in the Underground Railroad, and it is a wonderful fable. It is not true. It has no historic. One book was written. It's called Hidden in Plain View. When you are talking about a story and you want to prove it as a fact, you need a minimum of 3 documentable sources for that information. There's only ever been one. A couple of problems with the book. What it basically did is said that there was a quilt code, and the quilt code was used in quilts as maps for enslaved people to escape to freedom. There's a respectful way to answer that, and then I'll give you my snarky way to answer that. The respectful way is to explain that there are no other sources, just the one book, that the Quakers had a lot to do with the underground. There was an Underground Railroad, but there's no quilt code. The Quakers had a lot to do with it. They wrote a lot of stuff down. Nobody ever mentions the quilt code. In the 1930s, during the the Works Progress Administration, people were interviewing. There were still a few people surviving who were slaves as children, and they were interviewing the children of slaves who had escaped. No mention of quilt code. The third respectful way is to explain that in the book, Hidden in Plain View, they show the code. 2 of the blocks, the sailboat block and the Dresden plate block, you don't see in quilts until the 1920s and 30s. So 2 of the blocks that give us evidence, you just don't see in early quilts. Now, would you like the snarky answer? Sure. All right. So one of the clues is that if an enslaved person saw a log cabin quilt on a fence with black centers, that was the sign of a safe house. Answer me this: when did they travel? And how were the streetlights? And who would leave their quilts out at? Well, that's actually, if there was a quilt code, you would. But that would be suspicious because the people looking would be looking for the quilt. Why does she have a quilt on her? It's nighttime. She's going to ruin her good quilt. So it's a wonderful story. But George Washington didn't cut down the cherry tree. And the other one that people don't like hearing is that Betsy Ross didn't make the flag. Betsy Ross's workshop made the flag, but there's no evidence that she did much beyond designing it. Her company, her people made it. Her people. Any other questions? Well, you're supposed to fill those out, and you can't leave until they're done. I don't know if you just put, is the title of not there? That's all you need. That's all they need. That's all they need. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your help.
I think we should all go to the New England Quilt Museum.
Oh,
and
you
see
should.
Are you there full-time?
I am not there full-time. I'm paid for 21 hours. I work between 0 and 60. Depends on what's going on in the week. We're just taking down guns, the gun exhibit, and on May 1st we'll open an exhibit that I'm curating called In Praise of Silk. And I love to curate themed exhibits. Silk obviously is the theme, because it gives me a chance to look for the oldest quilt that I want to show, and I go right up to some of the high-end machine quilters who just doing, like, you just want to take that quilt and it's just so gorgeous. I've got some crazy quilts coming. We're having some silk dresses that are the Victorian period that are related to the crazy quilts. A lot of art quilts and a lot of fun and funky stuff. And you guys, it probably would only take you like 35 minutes to get to Lowell, right? Well, Lowell's not far. And we're open at this time of year, Tuesday through, well, by the time the show opens, we'll be open, we'll be only closed on Sunday. Monday, and we're open from 10 to 4. And if you come down on the weekend, the parking is free behind the museum in the bank parking lot. It's a good time to come down on a Saturday or Sunday because you can park right behind the museum. Thank you for asking.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sally Woodman, who arranged this program with Pam and with New Hampshire's Humanity.
Thank you.
Sally has another program scheduled for us in September that you could put on your calendar now. September 25th, 13 days in October, the Untold Cuban Missile Crisis story.
Ooh,
A little more in history. Thanks.
should be a good one. Okay, I don't. You have to give them to Sally.